August 22, 1983. The morning is bright, sunny, just wonderful. After breakfast, we take out timber from under the rock for an extension to the hut. The Lykovs agreed to move to the lower hut, but it is filled with various boxes and tools. Therefore, an extension is needed to transfer all this there, and then it will not be so crowded in the hut. The timber was harvested by foresters, but the helicopter dropped boards, timber, blanks to windows, doors not on arable land. And on the edge of the cliff all this flew down under the cliff. More than half broke. They worked until almost 2 o'clock, they were pretty tired, but they pulled out everything. They dug a hole in the brook, or rather they did not dig it, but pulled out a lot of stones with their hands. We washed ourselves up to the waist with cold water. What a pleasure! And the day is bright and hot, like in the height of summer. How soothingly creepy around, only somewhere in the distance a stream is rustling. Primordial, majestically powerful nature. Today Agafya, as we all call her now, and she likes it, again told me about medicinal herbs, which they use. I hear the names: golden root, honeydew, rose hips, blueberries, ruchanka, juniper, wild rosemary. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 geologists came from the Karp River. One trainee student and foreman of the obozu mine, Nikolai Petrovich Proletsky, years old. Again the guests were given a warm welcome, treated with pine nuts. At the end of the day Karp Osipovich led us to the rock, in the crevice of which the bear lived in winter. He caused them a lot of trouble, he ruined the storage shed, ate a lot of food, even came to the hut. They shot this bear the next summer, but did not kill it, with a crossbow, alert on the trail. Geologists Lykov presented an old burden, so they used it against the bear, otherwise, there was no save. The wounded bear was killed by another bear. This crevice is not far from the hut, higher up the mountain. The cave bear spent the winter in this crevice, closed from the rear, like in a fortress. Nikolai Petrovich and Lev Stepanovich secretly photographed their grandfather. He either really didn't notice the photographers or pretended not to notice. After visiting the bear lair, Agafya led us through the upper arable land, showing a pit for catching a merle. Elk or elk. Agafya walks through the mountains quickly and somehow very dexterously, you can hardly keep up with her. We already feel better on the trail. At the very top of the mountain, on the pass, a large hole was dug, depth 3 meters, width and length around it. And this is on the rock. The walls of the pit are reinforced with thin logs. It is obvious that the animal could not catch on the stones sticking out of the wall and get out of the pit. From above, the pit is covered with twigs and moss. When a moose tree falls into the pit, it is killed from above with a knife tied to a long stick. Agafya and Natalya dug the hole for 3 days. I present this hellish job for fragile, small creatures. Agafya says that the brothers did not help them much in the household. And she herself is great. He knows how to do everything: sew a spade, shoes, put ice traps, pick berries and herbs, dig potatoes, climb cedar for cones, make skis, spin fabric, read, write and much, much more. Agafya is very afraid of the camera. She says that this is a great sin and it is impossible to dissuade her. He says that when they were visiting geologists in Cairo, they were asked on their knees not to photograph them. Otherwise they will eat nothing and die in the atonement for this sin. According to Agafya, the geologist Akulina nevertheless secretly photographed them, for which they are very offended at her. And one hid in the bushes, in the thicket, and also photographed us. But only a beast attacks a man from the thicket, says Agafya, referring to the well-known correspondent. A master from Obozu, Nikolai Petrovich, walked with us to the pit, tried to photograph Agafya. Perhaps he has not yet quite grasped that she is very afraid of this, and in her opinion, photographing is a grave sin. She was so worried, hid herself, covered herself with a handkerchief and even fell to the ground face down. All attempts to get the photograph had to be left until better times. Agafya explaining why she is afraid of the camera says, photography is the enemy's cunning. The holy prophets described everything and foresaw everything. In unison, Agafya's grandfather says, the cat had kittens, 5 of them. Vasily Mikhailovich photographed the kittens, they died. Agafya continues, there are 3 things to be afraid of: cards, understand, photographs, an oath of an animal image. Above all, a murderous seal. As far as I understand, a murderous seal is, for example, a workbook or a passport. There is no rest from them, they take away freedom. Nikolai Mikhailovich presented Agafya with a red shawl with specks. She washed it in the stream and promised to wear it. Agafya showed the mushrooms, sieve, which they boil and bake. I collected 5 pieces for her and asked to take them. It is impossible from someone else's hands, was the answer. Then I tell her, wash them in water in a stream and then you can eat them. She agreed, but so far the mushrooms are spread out on a rag by the door of the hut. Will it cook or not? Agafya says that they drank a decoction of the golden root. Someone in Cairo told them that it should not be taken when a person is very sick. And they gave it to Dmitry shortly before his death. This greatly confuses Agafya, didn't they make it worse? I calmed her down as best I could. In the evening, one geologist and a student went back to Cairo. Pavel Mikhailovich alone stayed until tomorrow. Nikolai Petrovich is going to live with us for several days. The remaining geologist, it turns out, is from a family of old believers, and Karp Osipovich immediately found a common language with him. We have developed the most cordial relations with Agafya. This child of nature knows and remembers a lot. She is kind and responsive. He gives us something all the time. Today she brought bread again for dinner. Involuntarily, sympathy and great pity are born for her. Agafya is logical, critical in her reasoning. He gently defends his innocence, using logically correct premises. Sometimes he even argues with want. Both Lykovs, especially Agafya, have a well-developed sense of humor. Karp Osipovich retains a good memory, while Agafya's is simply magnificent. It's amazing how much she remembers. For example, she calls all people by name and patronymic. Whoever came to them or whom they saw from geologists in the village. She remembers the thick holy books almost by heart. In the evening the wind blew, the clouds pulled. The weather is likely to turn bad again. Lev Stepanovich reads Peskov's Taiga Deadlock by Lykov and Zhuravlev's articles written about them. Karp Osipovich was very excited by the suggestion that he had killed his brother and took his beautiful wife. Karp Osipovich said with excitement, "We were not guilty, this is not true, but in the upper Tashtip there is a witness how Evdokim was killed and he was already making inquiries." The grandfather was so agitated that his hands were shaking and speech was interrupted. I had to calm him down. In the evening, already in the first hour of the night, Agafya approached the fire, and then Karp Osipovich and told us that Pavel Mikhailovich, a worker of the Geological Party, had asked to stay with them for the autumn and winter. He promises to help them bump and dig potatoes, prepare firewood. I would like to consult with you, said Karp Osipovich. It was pleasant to note that Karp Osipovich addresses us as his close people. We, of course, advised you to take a closer look at this Pavel test in the words of Karp Osipovich. We need to consult with Lev, he was already asleep, said Karp Osipovich, and we wished each other good night. But, probably, for Karp Osipovich the night was not very calm, he was so excited. As soon as dawn broke, he slipped into Lev Stepanovich's tent to consult. August 23. In the morning I had an interesting, frank conversation with Pavel Mikhailovich. Probably he is not a bad guy, 34 years old, is not married, does not drink vodka, he probably sincerely wants to help the Lykovs, as well as earn extra money on nuts and hunting, he says this directly. With a practical, strong peasant grip, he even figured out what and how he would do, where to set traps, where to lay hunting paths. Probably he, like the Lykovs, is of the old believer faith. Almost all day, with a lunch break, they were cutting down birches, more than 10, and sawing them for firewood. Pavel Mikhailovich gave orders respectfully. One can sense a strong peasant leaven in him. Towards evening he went to Cairo to his superiors for permission to stay with the Lykovs. At lunch, Agafya brought us some cooked sieve shakers that I collected yesterday and gave to her. She gave us a treat and, at my insistence, kept a part for herself. After all, she took them from the worldly hands. When boiled, the mushrooms turn from yellowish to reddish brown. They taste very good. Although I know mushrooms quite well and love to pick them, I haven't come across any sieve shanks so far. You need to look in the books, maybe they're officially called and not so. Agafya today showed, or rather did the usual work, how to collect cones. She went to the cedar, took off her moccasins, stayed in thick socks, woven from hemp threads, and in a few seconds was on the top of the cedar. The speed was simply stunning. With a special stick with a flyer, she began to knock down cones. Just as instantly she descended from the cedar, as if on a smooth pole. This is class. During the day Agafya climbed more than 15 cedars and collected 2 bags of cones, and this, not counting many other work. 2 days ago I chose a place for myself on the edge of a cliff behind the Lykovs' hut. A majestic panorama of the Abakan canyon opens from here. Power and immensity, pristine beauty. I think well here, and here I am writing these notes. In the evening, Agafya lit a small fire near the entrance to the hut. It is built between the stones and Agafya cooked fur on it to give her grandfather a drink, his back ached. While the fur and some other brew were being cooked at the stake, the bearish stories of Karp Osipovich and Agafya began. Dozens of cases of meetings with this beast were told with genuine folk humor, lively and interesting. From these stories it followed that the bear is an intelligent, very strong, cunning and evil beast, stopping at nothing. Please share this video on your social networks, using the buttons under the video and subscribe to the channel. I ask you to go and watch other videos about Agafya Lykova, which you can see now on the screen in the end screensavers. There are a lot of rare and interesting facts about the Hermit. Thank you all for watching. Collectivization of the early 30s of the last century was rapid. The main task is to unite all peasants without exception into collective farms, the so-called collective farms. And not only people, but also livestock, cows, horses, agricultural machinery, etc., regardless of anyone or anything. All this was done almost in an orderly manner. For refusing to enter the collective farm, all the so-called kulaks, part of the middle peasants, were deprived of everything, evicted from their own homes and exiled to Nurim. The old believers gathered and discussed for a long time the grief that had befallen everyone. A wide variety of options were offered. Some advised to go further into the taiga, others insisted to leave through the ridges to Triad, since the border was almost closed, and some insisted to stay in place and wait for what would happen. Later it was said that delegates came, gathered people and talked a lot about the benefits of collectivization. One old man, telling me about the time, said, "They tempted with satanic speeches. After their speeches the men began to scatter through the taiga, but they lived freely, did not interfere with anyone, there was a settlement in every log." Opinions were divided, and they began to make decisions, each according to his own understanding. Some managed, having crossed the mountain ranges, to go to Tuva, others tried to move closer to the workers' settlements, where there was government work, but the main part remained in place, and an agricultural atoll was subsequently organized in the village of Tishi. And the Lykovs and their relatives moved to the upper reaches of the Abakan, and on its right bank, at the confluence of the Karp River, they settled down. 5 walled huts were cut down here in a short time, and this village received the official name of the Verkhnya Yakurchik Zamka. In any case, this is how it is indicated in the documents. In total, 6 families moved here, of which 3 are the families of the Lykov brothers, Stepan, Karp and Evdokim. There was nowhere else to go. So they settled in this remote taiga place, naively thinking that they would not be reached so easily, and they could survive here a dashing time. However, they did not lose touch with the world. They closely followed everything that happened in the state. And now one should not judge the correctness of their decisions. In those years when it was so simple, suddenly, so to speak, without preparation, the authorities decided to dispose of the fate of the bulk of the inhabitants of Russia. Many were confused. In those years, scientific expeditions began to appear in the Altai and Sayan mountains, which were engaged in the study of this territory, which is of great scientific interest. And there were plenty of white spots in the nature of Siberia. To work on expeditions, guides and workers were invited from local residents from among the hunters and taiga. All these people were experts in flora and fauna, medicinal plants. And they knew the area like the back of their hand. Young men eagerly accepted invitations to work on expeditions and provided invaluable assistance in collecting various scientific material, creating a camp life, caring for horses and preserving expeditionary property. Timely warned about the approach of any life-threatening natural phenomena according to only they know the signs. And often they unwittingly became assistants to the chiefs of expeditions. Their knowledge of nature gave them unquestionable authority. And we must give them their due, they helped in the study of the nature of the Altai-Sayan mountain taiga system. In the reports and works of researchers who traveled in the Altai and Sayan mountains, you can find dozens of names of local residents who took part in expeditions, to which the scientists refer. These are residents of the northeastern Altai and western Sayan, in particular the lower, Tisha and upper Kirghiz settlements. Their close relatives still live in the villages of Altai and Sayan. The surnames of Molokov, Demenev, Shmarin, Zolotayev, Bursand, Samolev, Perev and others appear especially often. And, of course, the Lykovs, whose surname was put on military topographic maps in the early 40s. In the 20s of the last century, the All-Russian Society for Nature Conservation carried out a great deal of work on nature conservation, where Schillinger, a man who roamed Russia up and down, was the chief specialist and great connoisseur of wildlife. The result of his numerous scientific expeditions was the creation of projects for over 20 reserves in the Usur, including the Altai one. Traveling through Altai and Western Sayan, Schillinger determined the approximate boundaries of the future reserve and, upon returning from the expedition, presented for consideration his project, centered on Lake Teleksy. The protected area included the most scientifically interesting places and rare natural landscapes. The creation of the reserve on Lake Teleksy was the most important event of the time. The reserve encompassed a significant part of the Lake Teleksy basin, its right bank, the right bank of the Chulishman River and the upper reaches of the Bolshoy Abakan River, and became one of the largest reserves in the Usur. Thus, the Verkhnyaya Kirghiz hut of the Lykovs ended up on the territory of the Altai Nature Reserve. The reserve was organized by the decree of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee and the Council of People's Commissars of the Rusvers on May 4, 1930. Local authorities, the Urot and Kavkaz Regional Executive Committees in December 1931, by a special resolution, recognized the opening of the reserve as expedient. In April 1932, a decree on the establishment of the State Altai Reserve within the Urot and Kavkaz regions appeared. Although the text of the resolution referred to the territory about 1 million hectares, in fact, its area was more than 1.3 million hectares. The main base for the management of the reserve was the village of Yelu. As soon as the rumor about the creation of the reserve got around, and people found out what kind of organization it was, residents of the nearby districts reached out to the reserve in order to enter such an interesting public service. Among them were the indigenous inhabitants, Altai and Old Believers. Taiga people, hunters, pathfinders, experts in Gorny Altai and Western Sayan were taken into the protection of the reserve by observers. Carpenters, joiners and peasants who know agriculture were invited to organize a subsidiary farm, build a village and cordons. The overwhelming majority of the hired observers in the guard were decent, modest, and at the same time decisive and courageous people. They all knew the taiga well, the conditions in which they would have to work, and quickly figured out the objectives of the reserve and their responsibilities. From their midst somehow immediately stood out, Molokov Danila Makarovich, whom I often mention in this story, is a kind, attentive, disciplined person. In the collective of the reserve, he enjoyed authority throughout the years of service in the protection. Molokov knew the Lykov family and many Old Believers living in the Western Sayan very well. The situation developed in such a way that almost all contacts with the Lykovs fell to his lot. Demenev Valerian Fedosevich was a match for Molokov, and the character and knowledge of the wild nature. An unsurpassed hunter-trap, a great connoisseur of medicinal plants. Observers deserve attention: Kulbakin, Tobakov, Kolovin, Buduv, Yakovlev, and Dadikov, Forrester Abramov and others. All of them have done a lot to equip this vast reserve. In the total Massachusetts of people who entered various construction and maintenance work, there were relatives of the Lykovs and residents of most of the Abakan settlements. Oshakov Moisey Osipovich, his relative Ivan Sergeyevich Brylyakov and Parfenty Filomonovich Kazanin stood out especially clearly. These conscientious and deeply knowledgeable people have been engaged in large-scale farming of the reserve for many years, until its liquidation in 1951. Kazanin is the father of 7 children, was a close relative of Lykov. The Osipovs, although far away, were also related to the Lykovs. Stepping back a little, I would like to say more about these people. Firstly, they all had contact with all the worldly ones, just like most of the inhabitants of Siberian villages had contact with each other, and we didn't feel any particular edge. But they stood out for their personal household management, hard work, cleanliness. The first of the Osipovich family to come to Siberia, during the reign of Alexander I, was Frol Osipovich with his family. They came from Perm and first settled near the city of Tomsk in the village of Borovushka. But they stayed here for a short time and soon moved to Altai, where they finally settled in the village of Ishpanik. The Frol family had 7 children. One of his sons, Osip, was born in Altai. He also had 7 children. His children were distinguished by their great growth, physical strength and a clear mind. Moses and Akinfi stood out especially. Akinfi Osipovich did not live long. He died before the war in the village of Yelu as a result of a medical error at the age of 29, leaving 7 children in his wife's arms. His eldest son Luka graduated from the 7-year school and, by self-education, comprehended working with metal, comprehended electric, turning, and auto business. His entire estate is a solid workshop. Forge, winches, metal and wood processing machines. He approached all works creatively. He designed and built a mini tractor, invented and installed automation on a lathe, invented an electric splitter to chop wood. All homework is done by units built by him. Luka is the father of 7 children. Now he lives in Altai in the village of Udalokka. Moisey Osipovich had no children. He was an attentive, sympathetic person. He was always one of the first to appear where something happened and, as best he could, provided help, if needed, to anyone who needed it. For many years he was in charge of the reserve's economy, and any work related to sowing, harvesting, haymaking and other matters was done in due time. He was tall, powerful in build and possessed great physical strength. His strength amazed everyone. There are many cases where he used his power to the great amazement of those present. I recall a funny incident that I witnessed. Once before the war we played on the shore of the lake, near the pier. The main warehouse of the reserve was also here. The warehouse was open, and we saw how one carpenter from the construction team, a rather large man of solid build, brought out of the warehouse, one by one, 2 large boxes of nails, put them one on top of the other on a block and waited for the cart to take the nails to their place. Construction. At this time Moisey Osipovich passed by. The carpenter, seeing him, smiling and joking, said, "Osipovich, take the nails away." Moisey Osipovich did not say anything, silently walked over, picked up both boxes more comfortably under the arm of his right hand, then turned rather sharply to the carpenter, bent down slightly, grabbed his legs in the knee area with his left hand, and straightening up, threw the carpenter with his stomach on his left shoulder and also silently and unhurriedly carried both the carpenter and the nails. It was 200 meters to the construction site. We rushed after them. Moisey Osipovich easily carried his burden to the construction site and, amid the laughter of the whole brigade, carefully put the carpenter on his feet, threw the boxes on the ground and, without saying a word, went about his business. Everyone was amazed and began to loudly estimate the total weight. It turned out in the range of 170–180 kilograms. At the beginning of the war, Osipovich went to the front. Throughout the war years, Karp Lykov and Kazanin were engaged in agricultural work. Both of them knew the peasant business perfectly, therefore there were no failures. Demobilized in 1945, Osipovich headed this work, and in the first post-war years, only wheat was harvested up to centners per hectare. This is an outstanding result, and the director of the reserve Martinov twice directed the submission to confer the title of Hero of Socialist Labor on Osipovich. Unfortunately, both views went unanswered. But let's get back to the beginning of the reserve's activities. The hired observers immediately began to arrange, first of all, the boundaries of the reserve. For this purpose, on all paths and roads, shields were installed with a detailed statement of the rules of conservation. A lot of explanatory work was carried out with residents of nearby villages and villages about what a reserve is and about its benefits in preserving and enriching nature. During the next detour of the border of the reserve, the head of the guard with the observers visited the upper Kojik Zamka and informed all residents that they are now on the territory of the state reserve, where any exploitation of nature is prohibited. They were introduced to the rules of conduct on the territory in detail and warned about the strict implementation of these rules. However, at the request of the residents, given the special situation, they were allowed to fish, collect pine nuts, mow the grass, in a word, what is necessary within the limits of personal need. The inhabitants of the Zamka were sympathetic to what they had to perform. Once on the territory of the reserve, they decided for some time how they should now be. On the one hand, they were limited by all sorts of prohibitions, which did not quite suit them. On the other hand, here they were, as it were, under the protection of the law. After consulting, it was decided to stay here for a while and wait for what would happen. All three brothers insisted on this, Stepan, Karp and Evdokim. Moreover, the head of the guard said that people would be needed here for protection and for the construction of a cordon at the mouth of the Koni River. The management of the reserve would not mind not touching this settlement, but at the time, in the midst of collectivization, all residents of separate settlements, on the basis of a special decree, were asked to unite into settlements, at least 10 households. There were also 6 courtyards, so the village was subject to liquidation. But, given that the settlement is located in the depths of the reserve and the inhabitants could be hired, they were left alone for a while. The question of the future fate of the village remained open. But fate made its own adjustments, ahead of thinking about what decision to make. In 1933, a terrible tragedy happened in the village on Karasu. At the beginning of summer, a common acquaintance of the inhabitants of the old believer Nikifor Yaroslavtsev came from the Lebed River. He felt a little nimble, complained of a headache, stopped for a few days to rest and wanted to move on. He made his way abroad to Tuva in order to find a place to live and then take his family there, as he did not want, like most old believers, to enter the collective farm. Every co-religionist who showed up and, naturally, brought a lot of news, was welcomed here, so he was welcomed. After resting, Nikifor left the village and went to Tuva. Soon after he left, several people in the village fell ill at the same time. The disease immediately alarmed everyone, since no one had encountered such a disease. It proceeded rapidly. All patients complained of severe headache, joint pain. It was difficult to get up, walk, there was frequent vomiting. The sick from time to time lost consciousness, raved, and, as eyewitnesses said, they climbed the wall from pain in the head, talked at random, lost their memory and died in agony. The first to die was grandfather Nazari, followed by matchmaker Galakshan Sanakin, father of Karp Osipovich, elder brother Stepan. Karp Osipovich, Lykov, Isai Nazarovich fell ill. The village froze, fell silent. Whatever they did, nothing helped. They did not have time to bury. It became scary. Fear gripped everyone. No one doubted that Nicephorus brought this disease, so everyone gathered and decided to go to someone on the Swan and carry the disease back from where it was brought. This mission was entrusted to carry out the light on foot Evdokim Lykov, who held on more tightly than anyone else. Before the next morning, a prayer service was served, and Evdokim went to the Swan before sunrise, taking the disease with him. He had to go over 150 kilometers of dense mountain taiga, crossing the Abakan ridge. Now it is difficult to say exactly what kind of disease it was, but judging by the symptoms and the way the disease proceeded, we can almost say with confidence that it was a form of meningitis. A terrible disease, especially since there was no medical assistance. Evdokim safely reached the Swan River and near the place where Nikifor lived, left the disease. But the most important thing is that on the day when Evdokim took away the disease and when the sun rose, the seriously ill Karp Osipovich Lykov, Isai Nazarovich felt a little better and recovered soon after. The disease receded. Nobody else died. In total, the disease claimed 5 people. In the 40s, I asked the former residents of those places, how was this done, how did he take the disease? One of the old believers said, answering my naive question. The Lord helped, we did everything right, as it should be, and after a pause, he added, in his thoughts he carried it. This is all that we managed to find out, but it could not be otherwise. Details of such treatments are not publicized. Interestingly, the disease hardly touched either children or women. Many years later, when I met Agafya Lykova, I asked her what she knew about the tragedy, and she confirmed to me almost everything that I already knew. And when asked what the further fate of Nicephorus was, she said, Nikifor died in Tuva. She knew all this from the stories of her parents. Later I learned that Nikifor had safely crossed the border into Tuva, found a place to live, returned, took his family and, once again crossing the border with his family, cut down the house and suddenly died. Unfortunately, no one at the time paid any attention to this tragedy. They just stated a fact. They died and that's it. The old believers themselves said, all the will of God. In a word, no help to the victims. And so it all went into oblivion. The Massachusetts of organizational issues in the management of the reserve did not allow in the first years to keep under control the vast territory of the reserve all the time. Of the means of transportation and communication, only riding horses, and the distances are hundreds of kilometers of taiga, mountains, passes, swamps, etc. The question of how to deal with the village on Abakan has been returned more than once. We consulted with the commander-in-chief and local authorities. But the time was special, collectivization was coming to an end, private property ceased, the so-called individual farms were crumbling with might and main, and in the village on Abakan there was no arthal, no collective farm, nothing. The proposal to leave the village as it is was rejected. Leaving it on the territory means officially committing a violation, which would significantly contradict the state law on the liquidation of private property. Therefore, it was decided to offer the inhabitants of the settlement to find another place to live and leave the reserve. In the fall of 1933, the observers of the reserve, Danila Molokov, Nikolai Buduv, Alexei Kobakin, Forester Semyon Abramov, headed by the head of the security, appeared at the hunt and, having gathered all the residents, explained to them that the high authorities did not allow them to leave them on the territory of the reserve, so they had to leave from the territory. The old believers silently listened to this verdict, realizing that no one would take any objections or complaints into account. They agreed with everything that was said and once again began to collect their simple belongings. It's a common thing. Well, getting out of here was much easier than getting here. Downstream, and there it will be seen, and we were almost ready for such a turn of affairs. The main thing is to move to where there is government work, just not to a collective farm. In the early spring of 1934, the inhabitants of Zamka began to leave this fateful place. Some of them floated down the river to their abandoned houses several years ago, and the family of Karp Osipovich, which by the time consisted of 3 people, went to Altai on the Swan River. Later, the inhabitants of those places said that Akulina Karpovna, who wanted to be closer to her native places, took her family to Lebed. Their first son was in his 5th year, but he was already quite firmly on the riding horse. Karp Osipovich chose a place to live in the town of Novikov, which is slightly higher than the confluence of the mountain river Kerchik into the Lebed River. And a little higher there were 2 courtyards, in one of which lived the Tropin's family, the future relatives of the Lykovs. Evdokim helped Karp's family move to Lebed, and he, in turn, promised to return in the fall and help his brother clean up the garden and move the family. In the meantime, one family of Evdokim remained at the hunt, who also planned to leave this place in the fall after harvesting and go down the river, which was officially reported to the management of the reserve. Evdokim's wife Aksinya was expecting a child, and this was the main reason for the delay, and their first young son was seriously addicted. Personally, Evdokim did not want to leave these places. He thought to stay and join the protection of the reserve at the cordon, which was to be built on the border of the reserve at the confluence of the Koni River into Abakan. He talked about this with the head of security who, in principle, did not object, especially since Molokov spoke positively about Evdokim and recommended that he be hired. This question has practically been resolved. But in any case, it was necessary to leave from the capture to Cairo. So the question of resettlement would have been resolved peacefully, but fate again brought its terrible adjustments to their lives. As it turned out later, other residents of the Abakan settlements, and not only them, thought about entering the protection of the reserve at the Abakan cordon. In a word, there were many applicants. But Evdokim was, so to speak, the number 1 candidate. This circumstance was the reason that the management of the reserve received an anonymous letter in which the characteristic of Evdokim Lykov was stated. The letter was transmitted through hunters and observers. This dirty, slanderous letter said that Evdokim was poaching, he was not going to leave the territory of the reserve, and if he was accepted into the guard, he would open the gates to his people for fishing on the territory of the reserve. They even agreed to the most incredible, as if Evdokim provided assistance to the bandits who took refuge in the taiga after the end of the civil war in Caucasia. By the way, Evdokim was 15 years old when the civil war in Siberia ended. Now it is difficult to say who was the author of this dirty letter, and it is impossible. Sinned on Zolotayev, on others, but all this in Philistine gossip. The management of the reserve immediately sent 2 observers to Abakan, Nikolai Rusakov and Dmitry Klishchinov, in order to understand and find out the situation. I must say that the management acted rashly in this matter, did not consult with people who knew the Lykov brothers well, did not take into account the fact that Nikolai Rusakov, always in a belligerent mood, was unrestrained, made decisions, obeying hot temper, fervor, without thinking about the fact that how it can all end. To resolve such serious issues, it was necessary to send the chief of security with those who knew the Lykovs well and the situation in the settlements on the Abakan River. Such people, of course, were reasonable, calm observers: Molokov, Deminov, Budov, Kulbakin, the young forester Abramov. In a word, there was no shortage of decent, experienced people. The head of security at the time was on a business trip in the regional center. It is clear that such a hasty decision was clearly rushed. The observers appeared at the hut unexpectedly for the Lykovs, who at the time were finishing digging potatoes, and immediately did not pay attention to 2 people who came out of the taiga with rifles in their hands. Evdokim was the first to notice the people walking towards them and quietly told Karp about this. The brothers stopped digging and carefully examined the 2 armed men walking slowly towards them. The Lykovs did not even think that they were the observers of the reserve, and they were at a loss. First of all, an incomprehensible and eerie form of clothing worried. They did not know that shortly before this the observers had received a special uniform. They wore black riding breeches, black tunics with bright yellow emblems on green buttonholes of turned-down collars, and black pointed helmets with small peaks on their heads. What kind of people, where did they come from, for what purpose they came, could not understand. Evdokim was the first to break down, shouting something, and rushed to his hut. Karp rushed after him. The observers did not even try to clarify the situation, did not tell them who they were, for what purpose they came. They did not even try to stop, introduce themselves and try to calm them down, and only then, as they say, discuss everything at a round table. No, this did not happen. On the contrary, Rusakov, seeing the brothers running, shouted sharply, "Stop, stop, I will shoot," and raised his rifle. Karp Osipovich stopped, but Evdokim continued to run. There was very little left to the saving hut, when a shot thundered, which, if to speak in essence, had to be fired upwards. But Rusakov shot, as it would sound now, to kill, shot in the back. Evdokim stumbled, began to fall and, restraining himself with his hands, pushed into the ground, but almost instantly jumped up and, without running into the hut, disappeared into the taiga. The bullet hit the left side, pierced the intestines, stomach and exited in the right side of the abdomen just above the navel. The wound is fatal. After running a little more, Evdokim hid in a cache. Aksinya, who saw everything, ran after him. I must say that the young observer Klishchinov, seeing that Rusakov raised his rifle, shouted, "Don't shoot, they don't seem to understand who we are." But Rusakov did not heed the voice of reason. 2 or 3 hours later, Evdokim died in agony in the arms of his pregnant wife. This is how this essentially scary clarification of the circumstances associated with the dirty anonymous letter ended, which Evdokim never found out about. The observers drew up a protocol in which they accused the Lykovs of allegedly resisting, thereby threatening their lives, and left the settlement on the same day. Karp Osipovich categorically refused to sign what he said was a false paper. Karp Osipovich and Aksinya remained together near the killed Evdokim, surrounded by taiga and the hopeless grief that had fallen on them. Late in the evening, they carried Evdokim's body to the hut, laid it in a hastily hollowed-out domina, and the next day buried close relatives next to those who had recently died from an unknown illness. After the funeral, Karp Osipovich floated Evdokim's family down the Abakan, and he himself went to his family on the Erinat River. Here the next year their daughter Natalya was born. She is the only one from the Lykov family who was born in Altai in the Turachek region of the Erinat Autonomous Region, now the Altai Republic. So this unfortunate village, lost in the dense taiga, ceased to exist. It turned out that they came here in order to untimely bury those close to their hearts here and then leave their expensive graves in an alarming unknown. Upon their return, the observers presented the director with a drawn-up protocol and a detailed explanatory note, in which, significantly distorting the actual events, they accused the Lykovs of armed resistance. This incident stirred up the entire village. Many workers of the reserve, who knew the Lykovs well, were at a loss. How could Evdokim, who sincerely wished to work in the reserve, when the question of his admission was practically resolved, provide armed resistance? In a word, they did not quite believe this, but, talking among themselves, they said that something was wrong here. The incident was reported to the area. An investigation was carried out, but somehow superficially, as if not attaching special importance. No one was brought before the court. Mid-30s. The most confused in their time. Well, killed, and what's so special? So it is to blame. In the spring of 1935, a group of observers led by the head of the security visited an abandoned village. Examining the surroundings of the village, they found that the bear had dug up Evdokim's grave, pulled out the corpse and ate it. The deck in which Evdokim was buried was lying nearby. Gnawed bones, remnants of clothing, and a half-preserved skull were everywhere. The observers dug the grave again, laid dry grass in the domina, laid everything that was left of Evdokim, and buried it again. Molokov, years later, told us that everything he saw then made a depressing impression on everyone. Cases of bears digging up corpses in rural cemeteries in Siberia are known, although they were extremely rare even in such remote places. The thing is that the shallowly buried bodies attracted the bears with the smell of decomposition, and in this case it was difficult for Karp Osipovich alone to dig a deep grave and even more difficult to lower the heavy log, so they buried Evdokim as best they could, to a shallow depth. In a conversation with Agafya Lykova, I asked her if she knew who had written the denunciation against Evdokim, or maybe she had heard anything about that case. To my surprise, she said with confidence, "Yermily Zolotayev proved on Evdokim." And to my question, how does she know this, she replied, Titenka said. By the way, Molokov was of the same opinion. The Lykovs lived in the Turachek region for almost 3 years. During this time, Akulina Karpovna managed to visit her native village Debovo, where she was born and where their relatives still lived. At the beginning of 1937, the Lykovs were unexpectedly visited by the Enkv officers and asked in detail how and under what circumstances Evdokim was killed. And although something threatening was not felt in the conversation, on the contrary, the employees sympathized with Lykov, said that the observers were wrong and that it was necessary to sort out this story. However, Karp Osipovich was alarmed in earnest. He began to think that this case would not end so easily, that observers could say anything, justifying their actions, and accuse him of something that had not happened. In that alarming atmosphere, when all people lived, not quite understanding what was happening in the country, when people began to fear each other, Karp Osipovich decides to leave for the taiga. And to leave so that no one knows where they left, where they stayed. And I must say that he succeeded brilliantly. Lykov took his family back to their native places in the upper reaches of the Bolshoi Abakan, where he knew literally every meter of the area. Now, many years later, it should be noted that by the time Lykov made the right decision, to go where they could least be expected. Exactly to where they were evicted several years ago. Later, when meeting with Molokov, he will say, "Then we would have left in peace, and they began to expel us from the dashing, now I will not leave at all from here." So they again found themselves on the territory of the reserve and settled on a small terrace on the right slope of the Abakan River valley. Please share this video on your social networks, using the buttons under the video and subscribe to the channel. I ask you to go and watch other videos about Agafya Lykova, which you can see now on the screen in the end screensavers. There are a lot of rare and interesting facts about the Hermit. Thank you all for watching. It is not possible to accurately judge the nature of the disease and the causes of death of the Lykovs, since none of the doctors saw them at that time and the case history as a document does not exist. Therefore, my conclusions are based on the stories of the Lykovs who survived. The main points that I highlighted were as follows. The Lykovs fell ill at the end of September, almost all at the same time. The first, after long cooling in water, was to try. According to Agafya, he suffered from shortness of breath, had difficulty breathing, fever, chills. As can be concluded, the Triad severe pneumonia, from which he died a week later. On the same days, all the other Lykovs fell ill. They also had symptoms of damage to the respiratory system, weakness, shortness of breath, a feeling of suffocation, cough, fever. Probably, Karp Osipovich was the easiest to get sick. Natalya was the most sick, she had hemoptysis. As the Lykovs say, after self-treatment with a decoction of nettle, rhubarb and bloodstone, celandine, their condition improved somewhat. However, hard work in the cold, digging potatoes from under the snow, preparing firewood, Dmitry's funeral, again led to a deterioration in the Lykovs' health. Savin symptoms of intestinal inflammation and bleeding from it, probably hemorrhagic enterocolitis, were added. With symptoms of complete exhaustion and loss of strength, he died. During Savina's illness, Natalya took care of him, did the laundry. By the way, after the death of Savin, all his dirty linen and outerwear were carried away from the hut and burned. It looks like the Lykovs understood that this could be a source of infection. After the death of Savin, Natalya's condition deteriorated again catastrophically, and after 10 days she died. At the same time Agafya was seriously ill and Karp Osipovich was easier. They also showed signs of pneumonia. Only by the end of winter did Agafya feel relief. The younger body coped with the disease. From what has been said, the conclusion suggests itself that the cause of the Lykovs' illness and death was some kind of infection, the development of which was facilitated by cooling, hard exhausting work and, of course, the weakening or absence of specific immunity. The milder course of the disease in the eldest Karp Osipovich is probably due to the greater training of his immune systems, since he grew up and lived for many years in the world, in contact with many people, and therefore with many infections. According to my observations, Karp Osipovich gave up a little, wrinkles increased, his back was bent. There is no longer that easy, flying, gallant gait, although he still looks younger than his years, fast, mobile, physically strong enough. The grandfather complains of frequent pain in the back and lower abdomen, hearing loss. The latter is probably only a small trick of the old man, since the hearing test showed him to be in good condition. At a distance of about 15 meters, he hears a slight click of the camera well. Karp Osipovich still sees well, reads his books freely even in low light conditions. His sense of color is the same as that of Agafya, it is not disturbed, he distinguishes color correctly. Karp Osipovich's face is swollen, especially under the eyes, which is probably associated with mosquito and midge bites. With excitement, his hands begin to shake, shortness of breath appears up to 28 times a minute, the veins in his neck swell. However, there are no clear signs of pulmonary and cardiovascular insufficiency. To the question, how old are you? He answered -82. 3 years ago he said -84. Why? According to my calculations, Karp Osipovich should be 87 years old. Agafya has grown somewhat stout. There is a slight swelling of the eyelids, possibly as a result of a change in the salt diet. And Agafya's eyes, it turns out, are grey-green. She notes that in the winter of 1981 there was a severe suffocation, it is both choking and choking, it is so hard, her strength has recently diminished, she began to get tired quickly, her sore hand interferes with her work. She complains of pain and swelling in the lower third of the left forearm, muscle weakness in this arm, a growth on the bone. Agafya also has a slight swelling of the joints on the hands. She feels in them, more in the morning, aches, numbness. Sis, I see a birch bark on the floor, I take it, there is no feeling, my hands endure, they have aches. It was from hard work in the cold, in the ground and dampness that she developed the phenomena of polyarthritis, inflammation of the joints. However, she refused the examination and our help. Clothes on Lykovs are no longer homespun. At first Karp Osipovich was wearing a light brown robe, like a hospital gown, dark trousers made of plain fabric and felt boots. Then, when he came to the fire, he was already in disguise, a grey felt hat, an almost black jacket, trousers and rubber boots, broad knee. Agafya was wearing a dark grey shirt, pants and fashionable rubber boots. Agafya saw a camera lying on a tree stump and did not go to our fire. Karp Osipovich came up and said that Agafya was afraid of our camera. We removed him, Karp Osipovich called Agafya. We spent the night in the Lykovs' hut on the floor, They were so cordially invited that it was inconvenient to refuse. Agafya was already asleep on the bench, and not on the floor, as 3 years ago. Karp Osipovich slept on a gobchik, a bench near the stove. The Lykovs got up at 7 o'clock in the morning. Between times we prayed, then we had breakfast. On the eve of the Lykovs, they cooked potatoes and soup, potatoes, rasula, rice groats. They ate everything, poured everything from the cup into a spoon. The potatoes were dipped in salt, maybe this is the reason for the swelling on the face. Agafya taught us how to make fire. A tinder is placed on the flint and a spark is knocked out by a crestal, a piece of a file. When the tinder gets warm, it is placed between two coals and the fire is fanned, and a splinter is inserted into the gap between the coals and it lights up. This is on fire for Agafya, but our attempts were unsuccessful. August 18. The Lykovs need to go to the lower hut to dry the berries, get a pine nut. We are going with them. He presented Karp Osipovich with a blue flashlight. The old man was overjoyed. Eyes lit up, smiled. He asked me to show you how to light it. I tried it myself, I liked it. Said it's from the sun, like the sun. Asked the price. I said 2-3 rubles. That's not very expensive, the grandfather stated. It turns out that he already understands prices. I explained to my grandfather that when the batteries run out, the light will be bad and will go out completely. How long will it burn, how to make it burn again? Followed by a question. Explained in detail and showed. The grandfather was satisfied. Agafya, as if in exchange, gave me a pair of her old moccasins, made of merle leather. A friendly exchange took place, everyone was satisfied. At 15 o'clock we all went together to the lower hut, leaving half of our things. The way took 35 minutes to the pass, and then descend for another hour and a half. The Lykovs tolerate physical activity quite well. So, when climbing a steep mountain for 30 minutes with a load on his shoulders, the breathing rate for Karp Osipovich was 32 times per minute, for Agafya -24, and for the members of our expedition it ranged from 36 to 40. After a 2-hour journey through the mountains, Karp Osipovich without stopping, he immediately took up other hard work, while the members of the expedition needed rest. On the way, Agafya showed the place where last year they put out the fire for 2 days. They were afraid that it would go to the upper hut. They extinguished until they lost their pulse, then they were sick for a long time. According to Agafya, only the rain stopped the fire. The trail goes all the time through blueberries, lingonberries, honeysuckle bushes constantly come across. Agafya showed us natural plantations of badan with surprisingly large leaves like cabbage. In the years of famine, they collected incense, boiled the root in 7 waters, and ate. They also used but to dye clothes shovels. Agafya walks along a path about 30 meters from Vyacheslav, who smokes, and expresses displeasure. What a bad smell, there is nothing to breathe. This is a demonic occupation. After going to the lower hut, Agafya treated us to red currants and nuts. The Lykovs are quite used to us, they keep themselves at ease, they talk freely. They said that the Triad refused the sacrament before his death. The Lykovs interpret this as, I did not want to die, I was young, I wanted to live. Before his death, Savin asked for fresh and salted fish and white bread and butter. The fish were given, but they did not have time to bring butter and bread from the Geologists. Before her death, Natalya bequeathed Karp Osipovich and Agafya to live in the lower hut, closer to people and better arable land. The Triad is buried near the lower hut behind the stream, Savin and Natalya at the upper one, together with their mother, who died 22 years ago from hunger. It was a terrible year, a terrible harvest failure, even the animals were gone, said Karp Osipovich. The Lykovs' mourning begins with Agafya's words, Taiga, bless. And the prayer begins. The Lykovs already eat rice, buckwheat, they especially love and consider oatmeal useful. Groats are sent by co-religionists and relatives. Eat 2 times a day. When they work hard, they still eat potatoes at lunchtime. The roof of the hut is covered with gutters. In a log split in half, a chute is hollowed out in the middle and the roof is covered, laying the logs alternately up and down with a chute. We watched Agafya bake bread. It includes dried potatoes with corn, ground to flour and wheat or rye flour in a ratio of about 6:1. The Lykovs have daily bread, ordinary, everyday, and festive. It is whiter than daily bread and is made of a bagel. Vasko, a new word heard from the Lykovs, means good in a superlative degree. By evening, Vyacheslav was going to go to the Geologists. They tried to persuade him not to go for the night, but referring to the lack of time, he still left. There is something restless in my soul. Geologists are about 20 kilometers away, and there are 4 hours of daylight left. Yes, and walking alone without a weapon in an unfamiliar taiga is not at all safe. Will it work somehow? I slept at night with Lev Stepanovich in a tent. We are trying to separate from the Lykovs so as not to infect them, which we set up not far from the hut, meters from the cliff. It rained most of the evening and night. August 19. After breakfast, the members of our expedition went to the upper hut for the rest of their belongings. Karp Osipovich blessed us on the road. The Lykovs themselves remained in the lower hut. Walking light was not so hard, despite the almost continuous uphill climb. Yes, probably, and we are already being drawn into the load. Weather with variable rain all day and evening. But we seem to be getting used to wet feet and clothes. Walking light, you can clearly see what pristine beauty is around. Going into the hut, they photographed her interior, objects and clothes. New additional windows have been cut in the Lykovs' huts. In the middle of the hut there is a stick with a metal trident at the end. This is a device for a torch, called light. The chimney on the hut is wooden, a hollowed out log, coated with clay from the inside. The chisel of the Lykovs from pre-revolutionary times with the stigma of some Petrov catches my eye. In the hut I counted 18 sacred books. There are very old ones, literally decayed at the edges. Some fat old book stands on the shrine and, probably, has not been opened for many years. It is covered in dust and turned black. 2 icons are very dusty. One depicts Christ, the other is so dark that you cannot tell what is painted there. Most of the books do not have the year of publication, but on 2 we find, Psalter, in leather binding, was published in the Moscow Old Believer book printing press in the summer of 74-23. The front book tells about what and how it will be after death, published in 74-19. In the hut everything is mixed up, old, made by the Lykovs, things and donated, civilians, 7 axes, many knives, scissors, candles, files, wire, enamel dishes, several pairs of rubber boots. Agafya was presented with a colored umbrella, but she does not need it at all, it lies under the roof. A flower is growing on the window in a birch bark tusa. Agafya has planted it. Under the roof hang beautiful Kamas skis made by Agafya from willow and spruce. I can imagine how worried the Lykovs are now, that we are alone in the hut. We will still do quite objectionable deeds. But, of course, we try not to touch anything with our hands and not change the routine. I remember how yesterday morning Agafya went out of the hut, looked with emotion at the huge burgundy poppy and said, "During the night the flower has grown." Behind her, Karp Osipovich solidly, on a low note, stated, "Bask." Elvira Viktorovna today painted a sketch, the Lykovs estate. We spent the night in the Lykovs hut, having flooded the piece of iron stove. In the morning I woke up due to the fact that the whole hut was in smoke. A firebrand remained in the stove. The story repeated 3 years ago, when we almost suffocated. Strange stove. August 20. As always, we got up with Lev Stepanovich at 7 o'clock. Bonfire, tea, talk. The rest are asleep. At 8:30 am Elvira Viktorovna is looking for a place to paint. I found it, didn't even have breakfast, and rushed headlong into work. In the evening we went to the lower hut. We went with a load, but quite easily. We get used to the loads. The hip belt is already fastened to the last hole. In the evening the Lykovs came to the fire. Interesting conversation about a bear, flights to the moon. They hold on freely, uninhibited. In a conversation, we hear words and phrases that are unusual for us. For example, got away, passed away, died, pokerke, call, sergeant, box, to go somewhere, commonplace, to go there and back in one day. Porch, the lower back, commercial, yes so. When I got it, there was a need, I brought water from the stream, says Agafya. Pograna, border guards, burned all the houses. Karp Osipovich talks about their forcible eviction from Lykovskaya Zamka. Their original place of residence is on the Abakan River. Sklinitsa is a bottle. Married. They stir up their minds, they continue to tell a lie. They encroached on a fish, but came with nothing. They wanted to catch a fish, but it didn't work out. There was a privilege, there was an easy life. Immortal clothes, cloth stored in case of death. Fire dope, vodka. Karp Osipovich, talking about a good man, says he doesn't get hurt with vodka, there is no art behind him. Karp Osipovich explains, there is no need to say thank you, because there used to be an idol, and worshipping an idol is not good. According to Karp Osipovich, once, when he scolded children, Dmitry said, "What a teacher, such students. What audacity." Protest. In the afternoon we were busy with the capital arrangement. We put up another tent, built a shed, and under it a table so that there was a place to store food, eat and sit and chat in rainy weather. The Lykovs threw branches of birch and cedars on the arable land. We asked, for what? Answer, for fertilization. This is probably not a bad fertilization method. For example, the Lykovs have been planting the same potato seeds for over 40 years, and the potatoes are just as good as before. The Lykovs have 2 cats and 1 cat, a gift from Geologists. They are very happy with them. Previously, a very large part of the harvest was taken away by mice and chipmunks, despite the fact that various traps, bowls, were constantly constructed for them. Now these rodents are successfully destroyed by cats. I remember how 3 years ago we spent the night in the Lykovs hut, so at night mice literally walked over us, and now they are inaudible. It is interesting that 2 cats independently travel from one hut to another, but this is about 8 kilometers through the dense taiga through the mountains. Moreover, they often make these journeys at night. The cats are often left alone when the Lykovs go to another hut, and apparently, do not suffer from hunger. They look smooth and satisfying. The Lykovs are very fond of them, play with them like children, stroke, caress, sleep with them. In general, these are equal members of their family. Agafya herself sues Lapatina for the fall from grey store materials sent by her relatives. She sews quickly, skillfully. She also cut herself. We praise for a good job. She smiles shyly, but it is noticeable that she is very pleased. Agafya gave Elvira Viktorovna a cross made of white metal, a little more than Natalya gave me 3 years ago. Agafya and Karp Osipovich persuade Elvira Viktorovna to stay with them. We will dig potatoes and knock them out. Nikolai Mikhailovich asked Agafya to show his sore hand. She laughed and refused. Then he says to Elvira Viktorovna, if Nikolai Mikhailovich was a Christian doctor, I would show him. Probably, this should be understood in such a way that they would accept the help of a baptized doctor of the same faith with them. In the conversation, it turns out that the Lykovs do not recognize healers and wise men. Agafya says, what is the use of magic? The body heals, but the soul destroys. Upon learning that my toothache is aching, Agafya gently teases me, saying, Doctor, let him heal himself. What phrases! It is immediately felt that Agafya remembers much from the Holy Scriptures by heart. August 21. Sunday. The Lykovs are resting. Agafya put on a black shawl with bright flowers. On her head she strengthened a ladder, an object for prayer, like a rosary, made by herself from the vertebrae of a grayling. Bright sunny morning. Found a very nice place. Immediately behind the Lykovs hut there is a sheer cliff and a wonderful view of the Abakan canyon opens from it. I put a plank between the stones. Behind my back there are 2 birch trees standing next to each other. I sit as in an armchair. Today we are going fishing, but while I have free time, I write down some of my observations and impressions. Agafya says that they came to the place of the lower hut, where we are now, 38 years ago. Agafya was then 2 years old. She was born on March 29, and she was baptized on April 3. They came from a parking lot, which they had on the Erinat River. It flows into the Abakan River above the Shek, 6 to 7 kilometers. They left the hut on the Erinat River because someone found them there. We moved to a new place in winter. All their belongings and food supplies, potatoes lasted 3 years, until they cultivated new arable land and got a good harvest, were transported on sledges. For almost the entire first winter, until the hut was cut down, we lived in a hut. You just have to imagine. In a severe winter in the taiga, live in a hut with small children. Please share this video on your social networks, using the buttons under the video, and subscribe to the channel. I ask you to go and watch other videos about Agafya Lykova, which you can see now on the screen in the end screensavers. There are a lot of rare and interesting facts about the hermit. Thank you all for watching. The appearance of people was a serious, if I may say so, stressful event, especially for the young Lykovs. It would be fine if they had to see and communicate with any of the people. But this is a special case. The two elders, Savin and Natalya, saw and remembered people, but practically did not have to communicate with them. The younger ones, Agafya and Dmitry, as I already wrote, have never seen people. Naturally, they could not truly imagine the faces of people, clothes, the manner of communication with each other, etc. Of course, they knew a lot about people from the stories of their parents, but throughout their lives they were inspired. With peace we cannot. And at once, like a snow on their heads, 4 people, 3 men and 1 woman. People, from whom they had been hiding all their lives, suddenly found themselves nearby, and not with some bad intentions, but with kindness and respect. One can only guess what the Lykov sisters, especially Agafya, experienced when these people boldly and at the same time modestly entered their gloomy home. For Savin and Dmitry, this event took place as if with preparation. As soon as the geologists who came for the first time left, Karp Osipovich immediately informed his sons that people had found them. He probably told them in detail about everything that had happened, and about how to behave, etc. In a word, the secret life was over, and now it was necessary, whether they wanted it or not, to adapt to a different way of life. And the next year, about 15 to 20 kilometers from the Lykovs' dwelling, a geological exploration party began to work thoroughly. Iron ore was discovered here, and the Minnesink complex expedition launched activities to clarify reserves, development opportunities and other aspects related to exploration of this deposit. The settlement of Geologists is located on the banks of the Abakan River at the confluence of the Karp River. By this time, the party workers who had been abandoned here already knew that in those places where they would have to work, a family of old believers had been living for more than 40 years, whose surname was inscribed on their maps. The leadership of the expedition immediately began to provide all kinds of assistance to the Lykov family. The leadership of the Caucasus Regional Forestry Department, headed by Nikolai Nikolaevich Savin, did not stand aside either. We must pay tribute to this man who did a lot to help this family. Unfortunately, I was not able to get to know or see him, but I use word of mouth. They all did a lot to improve their life. It was expressed in building a house, in providing tools, clothing, some food, and in chores. Most of the party workers showed great interest in this family and, at the first opportunity, tried to visit their home, to see with their own eyes that all this is reality, and not someone's fairy tales. I wanted to see these hermits ourselves, some sincerely sympathized with the Lykovs, some out of idle curiosity, and some for show, so that later in Philistine conversations they would say that they had seen and know well these people, and draw their own conclusions. Knowing that the Lykovs do not have much of what is necessary for a normal life, everyone tried to help them with something. We must also pay tribute to the many who met with the Lykovs. All of them reacted with understanding to the tragedy of this family and, in every possible way helping them to understand a completely new life for them, involuntarily became, as it were, curators, guardians. Everyone wanted to do something pleasant for them, teach them something, give them something, etc. Almost everything was a wonder for the Lykovs. Clothes, dishes, various household items, food, new incomprehensible words, names and much more. But cars, machine tools, helicopters, electricity, TV, undoubtedly, amazed the imagination, and things happened in the minds that made you think about many things that remained behind the back of life and which now, with all the desire to turn, is no longer possible. One can only state all this as a fact, but no more. From all this, they remained aloof and at a distance that could no longer be conquered. The young Lykovs often began to appear in the settlement of Geologists. They wanted to see something new, but the main thing that was difficult to cope with was their craving for people, craving for communication. They wanted to look at the faces of men and women and talk, and with everyone they visit broadened their horizons. They learned a lot from the fact that throughout their lives they did not know at all what was in their minds behind the barrier of their thinking. And all this not only amazed and worried, but they probably began to look at their personal lives from a different point of view. Of course, they wondered why everyone can, but they can't. During frequent conversations with people, they began to understand that much of what was suggested to them and what was forbidden turned out to be not quite true, and the peace about which they were told that we cannot be in peace is not explaining why. He turned out to be kind, friendly, and did not carry anything except kindness and respect. Gradually, the young Lykovs got used to it, and, despite the stormy flow of information that surged like a swift mountain river, they began to understand a lot. They understood perfectly well that everything they had to face and what to see was the creation of people like themselves. In a word, they comprehended a lot rather quickly, and it could not be otherwise. Normal mental development, ingenuity, natural ingenuity helped to comprehend everything that caused surprise. They gratefully accepted everything that the inhabitants of the settlement of Geologists offered them. These were household items, clothes, shoes, fishing tackle, etc. In the village, they saw young men and women, some married couples, and this, undoubtedly, excited the mind, especially since people told them directly that they could live the same way as everyone else, have a family, children, if their father would not have made this terrible fatal mistake, hiding behind the fact that, in peace we cannot. And it was precisely the questions of marriage, family, the desire to have their own children that were, perhaps, the main reasons for their disappointment and painful thoughts. The sisters found a common language with the women, eagerly listened to their arguments and in turn, talked about their difficult life. The eldest Savin, who experienced any adversity most of all, was averse to the new more than all other family members. Apparently, the suggestions that the head of the family repeated throughout his life, hiding behind faith, and his personal memories were so entrenched in his consciousness that it was very difficult to rethink all this. The youngest Dmitry, on the contrary, was drawn to people, to everything new, was interested in literally everything, and, as the inhabitants of the village said, sooner or later he would go into the world. Dmitry was the first to taste worldly food, in particular, bread, porridge, condensed milk, and admitted that he liked it. The young Lykovs did not shine with health. There was never milk, eggs, ordinary bread in their diet. There were no major vegetables, carrots, cabbage, beets, tomatoes. There was never any fruit, and what is hunger, they experienced more than once. In addition, they spent most of their lives literally in the twilight. For their entire closet, in which they lived, a tiny window about 10 by 15 centimeters, capable of giving light only to distinguish objects and not collide with each other. And the family spent about 70% of their time, if not more, in this small, gloomy, black-walled dwelling. Therefore, as the residents of the village noted, they looked pale, men with thin beards. They did not differ in any strength, density and strength of constitution. What could not be said about the head of the family, who looked quite normal for his age, was strong and healthy. He grew up in normal peasant conditions, where there was never a shortage of everything that the Siberian peasants used. Gradually, people began to get used to each other, and it seemed that a certain time would pass, and much in their life would fall into place. Relatives of co-religionists began to visit the Lykovs, who also tried to open their eyes to the environment, to the laws, in a word, to the life that had become the norm of the whole society. But life's fate again, for the umpteenth time, has made its ominous adjustments. This short development of friendly and useful, primarily for the Lykov family, relations unexpectedly ended tragically. In the fall of 1981, Dmitry suddenly fell ill and died a few days later. And although there was an opportunity to seek help from a doctor who offered her services, the Lykovs did not do this, explaining, everything is God's will. And 2 months later, Savin and Natalya died within 10 days, and they also did not seek help from a doctor. Did Karp Osipovich understand that even here, when the children were on their deathbed, he, not allowing them to see a doctor, involuntarily contributed to their death? Had the doctors had time to help and save the sick or not, it's hard to say, but everyone's conscience would be clear. But let's leave the reproaches, the fact has come true. At all times, from ancient times, peasants who fell ill with any disease turned to a local healer for help and did not see any sin in this. The cause of death of 3 Lykovs at once is contact with people. The Lykovs have lived all their lives in the pure dark coniferous taiga, where there were and could not be any pathogenic bacteria due to the fact that the air in the taiga is filled with so-called phytoncides. These volatile substances, emitted by plants, especially by conifers, literally saturate the air, and the Lykovs were not in danger. Figuratively speaking, throughout their lives they were, as it were, in an absolutely sterile capsule, which generally weakened the immune system, since they had never been attacked by any diseases, so their bodies were completely unable to withstand any, if I may say so, the slightest infection. And in the environment in which they found themselves, meeting people, among whom there could be carriers of various infectious diseases, the Lykovs turned out to be precisely those objects with which any infection was not difficult to cope with. This, without a doubt, so, and there could be no other reasons. But what kind of diseases it was that so easily knocked down, it seemed, strong organisms, now we no longer know. In addition, an important role was played by that stressful state, a nervous shock when people who came in peace burst into their lives with a cannonball, the same as themselves, but completely different. The only thing that the Lykovs could never get sick with is tick-borne encephalitis. Inhabitants of all taiga villages, Zamek never got sick with encephalitis, although from an early age, from infancy, they were exposed to tick bites. We all pulled dozens of ticks out of our bodies every spring every year. Ticks were pulled out of cows, horses, dogs by the hundreds. Obviously, the ticks themselves, biting us, gave us vaccinations, or so, in any case, the doctors explained to us. 7 years later, in 1988, Karp Osipovich died. He died at the age of 87 on the same day and month in which his wife Akulina Karpovna died back in 1961, that is, February 16. Agafya Karpovna said that in the last days and hours of his life, Karp Osipovich, in a semi-conscious state, tried to go somewhere. Thinking over the last hours of his life, I come to the conclusion that even in such a state, the instinct of self-preservation worked, and he tried to get away from everything and everyone. This is how a lonely family ended its existence, who knew where it lived, abandoned everything earthly for some reason. Only one youngest daughter, Agafya, remained, who, referring to the fact that the Tianka did not give blessings, categorically refused to go to her relatives who offered her a good place of residence, including promised to cut down a house and equip an economy. While in the village of Kilinsk, where Agafya was staying with her close relatives at the time, I took part in long conversations with Agafya, along with Paskov and a group of local fellow believers. All our persuasions, proposals to move to relatives for a residence had no effect. Agafya was adamant, and you can understand her. And it was evident that our persuasions were painfully reflected in her soul. She stayed in her native place, where she was born and raised. And this would be done, perhaps, by everyone who would be in her place. In any case, I personally agree with her decision. She knows this life to the smallest detail, knows what, where and when to do. She is not busy with hard work. She knows how to do everything in the life in which she found herself. She does not know another life, and she will not be able to rebuild in a different way. And it is also important that, being in the midst of people, she can, with her health, at any time become a victim of any infection. I will not repeat what I have said many times. I will say one thing, that now is a different time, and she is practically not threatened by a lack of food, clothing and other things. People helped, and the main role in that help and in the fact that all of Russia learned about the tragedy of this family, of course, belongs primarily to Paskov, who tactfully and thoroughly told the world about what happened in the taiga wilderness of the western Sion mountains. In a word, Agafya Karpovna will never leave her birthplace anywhere. Moreover, in the place where she lives and around her there are, according to my calculations, at least 11 graves, where the people closest and dearest to her heart are buried. She stayed near them. Here the difficult and inherently rare life path of this long-suffering family from the Lykov family will end. Once, in a circle of friends, during a conversation about the fate of the Lykovs, when I was talking about what I know myself and what eyewitnesses told me about their life, my good friend, a sociologist, said that the tragedy of the Lykov family is an echo of the split and the October Revolution. It seems to me that he hit the mark. Now Agafya Karpovna is surrounded by attention, she is helped in many ways, and in this respect, thank God, everything is fine. All attempts to add someone to her in order to smooth out the loneliness ended in failure. These attempts will never be successful. Now there is no one who could easily endure these conditions, the hardships of life, and be 100% like-minded. There are simply no such people, even among fellow believers there is hardly anyone. I mean, no one will be able to live there the way she lives, for the simple reason that there is no other life around and no common language can be found. Please share this video on your social networks, using the buttons under the video, and subscribe to the channel. I ask you to go and watch other videos about Agafya Lykova, which you can see now on the screen in the end screensavers. There are a lot of rare and interesting facts about the Hermit. Thank you all for watching. In August 1978, an ore deposit was discovered in the upper reaches of the Abakan River. Geologists from a helicopter saw a vegetable garden with potatoes. Where is he from in desolate places? The nearest village on the river is 250 kilometers away. Having landed, they found people who lived in pre-Petrine times interspersed with the Stone Age. With a splinter without salt bread. In 1982, Komsomolskaya Pravda journalist Vasily Peskov visited the Hermits. The country was read by the Lykov Robinsonate. But there was a blank spot in the taiga impasse. Peskov traced the 300-year-old path of the old believer family, the Volga region, Altai, Siberia. Why did the family live in the wilds of Abakan all alone? Agafya's father Karp Osipovich Lykov spoke of those years dully, indistinctly, with apprehension, wrote Peskov. He made it clear it was not without blood. Nicholas I abolished the persecution of old believers. But a revolution broke out, then collectivization. Many old believers remained in the village and created an agricultural cartel. And the Lykov brothers, Stepan, Karp and Evdokim, together with their father and 3 more families, moved to the upper reaches of the Abakan. They cut down 5 walled huts, hoping to survive the satanic times in the wilderness. Their village was called in the documents, Verkhnyaya Kurhakskaya Zaimka. The author of the book, Lykovs, Tigray Dalkit, restored those dramatic events. His father, biologist Georgy Dalkit, was in charge of the scientific department of the Altai Nature Reserve. In 1930, by a decree of the Council of People's Commissars of the Rusfers, the Altai State Reserve was created. The hitch was on its territory. The authorities announced to the old believers that they were not allowed to live here, hunting and fishing were prohibited in the reserve. Projects scattered in all directions. Only Evdokim Lykov was allowed to stay. Ksenia's wife was expecting a child. In addition, he agreed to work in the conservation of the reserve. But there was an anonymous denunciation. They say, Lykov is a poacher, he will kill all the animals. Officers Rusakov and Klishchanov were sent to check the signal. The brothers were digging potatoes. Karp came to help Evdokim, and did not immediately notice the armed men. Black riding breeches and tunics, black pointed helmets on their heads. This form was introduced in the reserve recently. The Lykovs did not know about it. The brothers rushed to the hut. Rusakov raised his rifle. Don't shoot, they don't seem to understand who we are, shouted Klishchanov. But he shot Evdokim in the back. The wound was fatal. To shield themselves, the guards drew up a protocol, accusing the Lykovs of armed resistance. Karp refused to sign the false paper. The murder was reported to the area. The investigation was carried out superficially, no one was tried. Eerie 30s. Shot means guilty. In 1937, the Enk raided the Lykovs. They asked in detail about the murder of Evdokim. It was decided to look into this story again. Karp was alert. The murderers of a brother can slander him during the investigation. They have more faith. That is why he took his family to the desert, the upper reaches of the Bolshoi Abakan. Mountains, taiga, hundreds of kilometers without shelter and no roads. Here in August 1940, the observers of the reserve met him. They offered a job as a guard at the cordon. A large semi-detached house, a bathhouse, barns, government food. They promised to bring a cow and sheep. They said that their brother's killers had already been punished. It was a lie. The head of the science department of the Lykov Reserve, the father of the author of the book, also participated in the negotiations. Karp's wife really wanted to move to the cordon, closer to the people. Children are growing. But Karp was categorically against it. Let us perish. How many people have been ruined, for what? Abakan was killed and we will be harassed. And he moved even further into the taiga. Fear of sharing the tragic fate of a brother shot before his eyes, the same blood. Which he later hinted at to Vasily Peskov, they drove the runner. Not faith at all. Soon the Great Patriotic War began. There was no time for Karp in the reserve. However, the Enk remembered him. By the end of the summer of 1941, the Chekists took control of all taiga settlements, so that deserters do not hide there. A detachment of border guards and security officers went on a raid to search for the fugitives. Old believer Danila Molokov, an old acquaintance of Karp Osipovich, was taken as a guide. From the conversations of the Chekists, he understood that the head of the Lykov family could easily be solved in the taiga. Karp noticed the detachment from a distance. And when Molokov fell behind, he called out to him. Danila said that a war had begun with the German, the Enk were looking for deserters. Karp Osipovich urgently took his family into the impenetrable jungle of the upper reaches of the Abakan. The same taiga dead end where the hermit Agafya still lives. In 1946, a detachment of military surveyors stumbled upon a refuge. It was put on the cards with the marks Karp Lykov. Karp and son Savin led a detachment of cartographers across the pass. But, returning, the cautious Lykov urgently moved higher into the mountains. To the alternate airfield, where for 2 years there was a covered log house in case of sudden relocation. Peskov described the story of the visit of cartographers in the taiga dead end. But Vasily Mikhailovich did not know the continuation of this story. The cartographers, of course, reported to the authorities about the meeting with the hermits. They told about their extreme poverty, their 3 children, Agafya was just born. The head of the Altai Nature Reserve was summoned to the regional party committee and made a suggestion: old believers are hiding from him, breaking the laws. The director proposed to relocate the Lykovs to the Abakan cordon, register Karp as a security guard, help the family. But the bureau of the regional committee decided to send the Enk to the old believers. In winter, the detachment went to the upper reaches of the Abakan. The Chekists hoped that the Lykovs would not run away until spring. They hoped to catch them by surprise. But the hut was empty. In the summer of 1947, the Enk Force detachment made another secret raid over the Abakan area. It turned out that all the old believers who fled to the taiga from collectivization in the 30s sooner or later returned to the people. And nobody heard about the Lykovs. As if disappeared. It was clear that if we had found the Lykovs, the head of the family would have been in trouble, writes Dalpat, who was the conductor of the Enk detachment. Lykov would have shared the fate of those who in those days dared to live differently. As it should have been. I mean that if he left the taiga, he would have been arrested and brought to trial. Gradually, they began to forget about the Lykovs in the reserve. And the Chekists also have other concerns. And so no one would have found out about the Lykovs, if not for the geologists on the helicopter. I also want to add a few words from myself. Studying the stories of Peskov and Lykov, there are a lot of contradictions and suppression. One feels that both of them were subjected to harsh Soviet censorship. None of them writes the truth about the death of the family of Evdokim Lykov. And this is very strange. In addition, studying the biography of Tigray Lykov, who, in parallel with Peskov, described the history of the Lykov family, we see that the writer worked as an employee of the reserve and in his narration in every possible way praises the leadership reserve of those years. That is, people who sent 2 murderers to Evdokim Lykov, and then covered up their actions. Also, we see that Tigray Lykov himself accompanied the Enk workers who were looking for the Lykov family for repression. Can Lykov be trusted after that? Did he write the whole truth? You cannot definitely believe. It is also impossible to believe the story of Peskov, Taiga Deadlock, which was edited by party censors. A big request to the viewers of our channel to write at least some information in the comments. About the death of Agafya Lykova, Evdokim's wife, about the death of their children and about the death of the grandmother of these children. This whole family lived in a hut on the Karp River. What happened to them? And why did an article appear in the local Altai newspaper in those years that Karp Lykov himself killed his brother? Then only Peskov refuted this slander. Please share this video on your social networks, using the buttons under the video and subscribe to the channel. I ask you to go and watch other videos about Agafya Lykova, which you can see now on the screen in the end screensavers. There are a lot of rare and interesting facts about the Hermit. Thank you all for watching. In the summer of 1941, Karp Lykov hastily took his family to the Erinat River in the upper reaches of the Bolshoi Abakan. At first, the administration of the Altai Reserve was not up to the missing family of old believers, especially that most of the foresters were drafted into the ranks of the regular army and there was no one to carry out raids on the territory. However, literally 2 months later, an order came to check all the remote cordons and hidden landings, in order to identify possible deserters and draft evaders. Together with the order, a whole detachment of ENK officers arrived to carry it out. The famous taiga dweller Danila Molokov accompanied the reserve from the reserve. The group, passing through the Kanuski cordon, entered Tishi, conducted a census and registration of all men of military age, and was especially interested in the fate of the Lykovs. Most of the inhabitants of the Zaimka answered that after Karp and his family left for Lebad, they had not heard anything about them. But the old foe of the Lykov family, Yermila Zolotayev, could not resist even here, so as not to insert their own 5 kopecks into their fate. He told the Enkveshniks that it was necessary to look for Karp with his family in the area of the Karp River. After receiving this information, the detachment went straight to the indicated area. Danila Molokov realized that the commander of the detachment had an order to pick up the children without much ceremony. This is the kind of care about the younger generation, and parents should have been dealt with based on the situation. Fortunately, there was no repetition of the tragedy that happened to Evdokim. They really almost collided on the counter, from which the Lykovs had already left by the time Karp came to the former dwelling to pick up the remaining things. Having packed everything, he was about to leave when he saw armed people through the bushes. The distance between them was about half a kilometer, but the Hermit patrolmen themselves were not visible. At first, Lykov wanted to go to Erinat as quickly as possible and take his family to the taiga. But then Karp saw Molokov in the guide and decided to linger to find out what kind of people came after their souls. The day was drawing to a close, and the Hermit rightly judged that the detachment would stop for the night in their hut. Buried in the needles under one of the age-old cedars, Karp prepared to wait for an opportunity. Who introduced himself early in the morning when Molokov went out to collect the horses released for grazing. The conversation between long-time acquaintances was brief. Danila told Karp about the outbreak of the war and about the order to destroy all taiga settlements. But the same Molokov, who apparently understood both the psychology of the old believer and the mood of the patrol detachment, advised the Lykovs to leave for Tuver Yenisei, explaining that the territory of the reserve Noveshniki will comb through everything, precisely in order to find all the secret caches. At parting, the forester shared a handful of cartridges with Karp and the Hermit hurried to Erinat, returning home with all possible precautions so that, God forbid, not leave a single trace. Lykov told his wife about the alarming news and took them to the taiga, and he went to the fort through Erinat to check exactly where the squad will go. As Molokov promised, they headed along the Kurumchuk River, past the secret dwelling of hermits. Karp secretly accompanied them for several kilometers and returned to Erinat reassured. Speaking of Lykov's desertion. Formerly, yes, he was a deserter, knowing, as it turns out, about the outbreak of war. Another question is who he had to go to protect. The new government took away his entire family, endlessly persecuting the old believers and forcing them to choose between life and faith. In addition, Lykov clearly understood that without him the family in the taiga would not survive. And Karp could not take them to Tishi. With the formation of the Artel, the settlement was no longer a reliable refuge. Please share this video on your social networks, using the buttons under the video and subscribe to the channel. I ask you to go and watch other videos about Agafya Lykova, which you can see now on the screen in the end screensavers. There are a lot of rare and interesting facts about the Hermit. Thank you all for watching.